Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about ecology and aesthetics. In this module we will look at the emerging subdiscipline of ecological aesthetics that concerns the aesthetic appreciation of the world in its entirety, including both the natural and built environments, and is consequently the broadest category of aesthetics. This area of study emerged as a distinct field in the later half of the 20th century, although its historical roots can be traced to the 18th century British and Scottish theories of natural aesthetics, especially their treatment of the picturesque in landscape painting, which culminating in Kant's analysis of the beautiful and sublime in nature. During the 19th and 20th centuries, aesthetic theory tended to focus almost exclusively on artworks and other objects of human design. But encouraged by increasing concerns with environmental issues among philosophers and the general public, a new interest in the aesthetics of nature and its relationship to the built environment has emerged over the last several decades. Ecological aesthetics today incorporates studies of the aesthetics of nature, including natural objects and larger world, such as ecosystems, gardens and landscape architecture, environmental and earth art, architecture and urban planning, and the relations between different modes of aesthetic appreciation appropriate to these different domains. This extension of aesthetic consideration to both natural and built environments has led to a reconsideration of traditional aesthetic categories and of central tenets of aesthetic theory. Explicitly phenomenological work in ecological aesthetics is still in its infancy, but the insights of many of the major figures in the tradition are applicable to this new field of study. Edmund Husserl's concept of intentionality and his description of the intuitively given experiential life world, for example, provide a concrete framework for understanding aesthetic experience as a basic and pervasive quality of everyday life. Martin Heidegger's appreciation of the role of earth in the formation of the network, his critique of the enframing character of modern technology, and his description of poetic dwelling as an alternative to modern technological civilization suggests parallels with contemporary environmental concerns and a critique of the humanistic limits of modern aesthetic theory. Max Scheler proposes the aesthetic value of nature as a paradigmatic example of the non-relativity of values. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's investigations of embodied perceptions and his later ontology of flesh hold implications for the epistemological and metaphysical foundations of an environmental aesthetics, and many of his writings on art address the relationship between the painter's vision and our perceptual experience of nature. Nicole Dufresne recognizes in pure aesthetic experience an incipient phenomenological education that brings to the fore the intentional bond between subject and the world, suggesting the particular appropriateness of the phenomenological approach for formulating a general aesthetic theory. His description of aesthetic objects as expressive quasi-subjects and of sensuous as a common act of the sensing and the sensed also pave the way for an elaboration of aesthetic into a philosophy of nature. Arnold Berlant, a leading figure in the development of a specifically ecological aesthetics, has been the strong proponent of the phenomenological approach in this field. His aesthetics of engagement, inspired by Husserlian intentionality and Merleau-Ponty's description of embodied experience, challenges core assumption of traditional aesthetics. According to Berlant, I quote, "The doctrine of disinterestedness that pervades aesthetic theory entails the separation of a spectator conceived as passive and primarily visual from an aesthetic object taking any practical connections with the wider natural and cultural context." In contrast, he holds that the human perceiver is embedded in the aesthetic environment and continuously interacts with it in an active, engaged and multisensory fashion. This participatory model of aesthetic experience treats environment as a field of forces continuous with the organism, a field which there is a reciprocal action of organism on environment and environment on organism, and is in which there is no real demarcation between them, unquote. This general model of aesthetic experience is equally applicable, he suggests, to the work of arts, the built environment and the natural environment. In fact, given the continuity between the human perceiver and the surrounding world, the cultural and historical information and formation of the concept of nature, and the extension of our technological influence to every part of natural world, it follows for him that there is no real distinction between nature and culture. I quote, "The natural world is no independent sphere, but it is itself a cultural artifact," unquote. On the basis of this aesthetics of engagement, Berlant develops a theoretical framework for negative aesthetic judgments and suggests a new model for education and aesthetic community that gives central role and central place to continuity, connectedness within a whole rather than a link between discrete parts, unquote. Although Berlant has been the first to offer comprehensive phenomenological theory of ecological aesthetics, other themes relevant to the field have also received extensive treatment by phenomenologists in recent years. Investigators of the role of place, for instance, have combined philosophy with cultural geography and environmental design to form a new area of study that David Simon calls phenomenological ecology. Edward S. Casey argues for a renewed appreciation of the role of place in human experience, which he sees as long obscured by our cultural and philosophical privileging of space and time, and he explores the lived body's role in the formation of place and the distinct characters of built, cultivated, and wild place worlds. His intellectual history of the hidden role of place from ancient creation myths through the 20th century devotes considerable attention to the phenomenological tradition, especially the contributions of Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. Starting from the originative thinking of Heidegger, Ingrid Lehmann-Stefanovic grants an ontological primacy to place in her proposal of alternatives to received notions of sustainable development. Gay Bacchus and John Murungi presents phenomenological analysis of systemic transformations of urban and suburban landscapes through their dialectical interaction with human activities. Eduardo Mendieta maintains that our very idea of philosophy, including its account of rationality and social agency, is informed by urban specializing practices, a point that he illustrates by taking Jean-Paul Sartre's phenomenology as a paradigmatic example. Other relevant topics of recent phenomenological investigation include the intersection of built and natural environments in gardening and environmental art, as well as the representation of the earth within literature and the fine arts. Collections edited by Anna Teresa addresses the representation and role of earth in literature and human existence and the phenomenological experiences of gardens, especially as figures of infinity and the sublime across a span of cultural and literary traditions. James Hatley finds in the land art of Andrew Goldsworthy a renewed interrogation of the relations between techne and physis that, rather than leaving nature untouched, approaches nature in such manner that our touching is also touched by what we touch, suggesting an aesthetic as well as an ethics of wilderness. Central to contemporary ecological aesthetics is the question of the relation between the aesthetic appreciation of artworks and of nature. Berlant, as noted above, stresses continuity of all forms of aesthetic appreciations that is grounded on the activity of the engaged and participatory human perceiver. In contrast, Alan Carlson emphasizes the difference between these two types of appreciation, holding that common sense of scientific knowledge is necessary for the aesthetic appreciation of nature. According to his natural environmental model, nature is an environment and thus a setting within which we exist and that we normally experience with our complete range of senses as our unobtrusive background, unquote. Nature becomes an aesthetic object when we shift our attention to certain foci within this all-embracing background, which are then experienced as forming an obtrusive foreground. Conceptual knowledge of nature is indeed needed to guide our selection of appropriate foci and boundaries for this shift of attention. Stan Godlovich, on the other hand, holds that such positions as Berlant's and Carlson's arbitrarily adopt the human scale of perception, thereby failing to appreciate nature on its own terms. As an alternative, he proposes an eccentric aesthetic aloofness, the leveling of all viewpoints to an anonymous uniformity within which the human standpoint holds no particular privilege. Only such an eccentric uniform view is capable of grounding moral respect for nature. Godlovich holds, since it leaves nature fundamentally inaccessible and ultimately alien. Clarification of this debate requires, first, a phenomenological account of aesthetic experience in general, and second, an account of what appreciation of nature on its own term can mean within the context of human experience. Aesthetic experience always involves a perceptual or sensuous core, which may take as its focus one sense in particular or a combination of senses and corporeal experiences. When viewing a painting or listening to a symphony, for instance, cultural convention teaches us to exclude as irrelevant everything but what the single focal sense conveys. By contrast, a stroll through a stand of old growth Douglas fir combines sights, smells, sounds, tactile impressions, and the kinesthetic sense of movement in a single aesthetic experience. This sensuous core of aesthetic experience may also be supplied by memory of imagination rather than by present perception, that is, remembering a musical performance or imaginatively anticipating a walk through the forest. Because the core of an aesthetic experience is always sensuous, such experience is always relative to the perceiver's spatial and temporal scale. The range of human spatial and temporal perception is a function of our sensory organizations and may differ significantly from the spatial or temporal organization of the unwealth of our sentient creatures. The aesthetic appreciation of works of art generally dictates a certain spatial or temporal context. We look at a painting from a certain distance and listen to a musical performance at a certain tempo. We may alter these contexts at will in some cases, and they may also be changed by habituation. Familiarity with city changes our spatial context for appreciating the architecture of a certain building or conceptual knowledge. The spatio-temporal limits prescribed by human perceptual organization may also be expanded technologically, that is by microscopes and telescopes or by time-lapse photography, which requires the translation or annexation of this broader or narrower spatial and temporal contexts to those that we are able to experience directly. In addition to such spatial and temporal contexts, the sensory aspect of our aesthetic experience essentially involves framing, the selection of certain foci as aesthetic and relevant against a broader background or horizon. Such selection reflects traits of the perceiver, such as concentration, attention span, expectations, personal history, and habituation, and it may also be guided by cultural norms and conventions. Framing of artwork is typically guided by convention. As with the literal frame of painting or the edge of a theatrical stage, and cultural framing conventions are not entirely absent when we look beyond the world of art. Directional markers and rain gutters are not the intended objects of appreciation on a nature trail, and signs along the highway mark the appropriate stops for a scenic overlook of the landscape. But aesthetic experience often extends beyond objects designed for that purpose or scenes that are culturally endorsed, leaving us with less well-defined guidance in our framing selections. The appreciation of sounds in nature, for instance, involves numerous selections that may be shaped as much by individual as by cultural preferences. How long we should listen, what counts as a foreground or background sound, whether human produced sounds should be excluded, and even whether we should parse natural sounds into relatively distinct melodies in a serial structure. The appreciation of landscape also highlights the importance of such framing. Since a landscape exists only as seen from a particular point of view, the landscape scene is a subjective object rather than a real part of nature. The sensuous core of the aesthetic experience is therefore essentially relative to the perceiver. But aesthetic appreciation is not reducible to this sensuous core, since evaluation, at least of a tacit sort, must be involved. Although both Berlant and Carlson restrict aesthetic appreciation to humans, we clearly share with many animals such sensory pleasures as basking in the sun or enjoying a thirst-quenching drink, which are candidates for rudimentary aesthetic appreciation. In many cases, human aesthetic experience will also include what Ronald Hepburn calls thought component, which is introduced, I quote, as we implicitly compare and contrast here with elsewhere, actual with possible, present with past, unquote. This thought component is not limited to conceptual thought and need not involve self-conscious awareness or reflection. Rather, it indicates that the sensuous core is accompanied by a mixture of emotion, imagination, conceptualization and metaphorization, and may also include elements of what Hepburn terms metaphysical imagination, a seeing as that interprets the presence and the present perception in terms of its metaphysical relevance for the whole of experience. Watching a frog have its innards sucked out by a giant water bug, as Annie Dillard describes in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, may provoke a grim realization of the chomp or fast law of life, extending to a view of the cosmos as essentially conflictual. A swim in the warm and calm waters of the Florida coast, on the other hand, might carry with it a sense of metaphysical immersion and fluid interconnection with all things. Such metaphysical imagination and thought component more generally cannot be treated as a superficial addition to the aesthetic experience. It is fused with the sensory components, not a mediation aroused by these. Despite the terminology, such components are not separable parts or layers added onto an unchanged perceptual substratum, but integral aspects of a single holistic experience from which they are separable only abstractly. Emotion, imagination and conceptual knowledge may even guide the sensuous framing of experience by directing one's attention to what may have otherwise escaped attention, so that the sensuous component and the thought component of an aesthetic experience engage in a naturalistic informing dialectic. This account of aesthetic experience incorporates in a limited way both the perceptual engagement described by Berlant and the influence of conceptual information stressed by Carlson. But the emphasis on spatial and temporal scale and the role granted by framing underscores Godlovich's concerns. Does aesthetic experience so described allow for appreciation changed by habituation? That is, familiarity with a city changes our spatial context for appreciating the architecture of certain building. Does aesthetic experience so described allow for appreciation changed by habituation concerning its success in taking nature on its own terms? And our judgments along these lines will always be open to revision in the light of further experiences. Among non-phenomenological contributions to ecological aesthetics, the dominant line of development has been the cognitive approach espoused by Carlson, according to which scientific knowledge is central to aesthetic appreciation of nature. He argues that 20th century philosophy of art downplayed formal qualities to emphasize the role that art history and criticism play in art appreciation. So our appreciation of nature should be guided predominantly by natural, historical and scientific knowledge. This emphasis on natural historical knowledge follows in the tradition of John Muir, Henry David Thoreau and Aldo Leopold, who tied the aesthetic value of nature to its ecological harmony and integrity, a position that has been refined in Bade Kellicott's land aesthetic. Because of its prioritization of scientific knowledge, the cognitive approach has drawn criticism for underestimating the importance of non-conceptual factors in our aesthetic appreciation of nature, such as emotions, imagination, and the ambient dimension of experience. Debate has also centered on what forms of knowledge may be appropriate for aesthetic guidance, with suggestions that scientific knowledge be complemented by indigenous traditions, folklore and myths, as well as by literary treatments of nature. Carlson has reflected his position in light of these suggestions and proposes that the cognitive approach be extended beyond consideration of natural aesthetics to provide a model for aesthetic appreciation of the world at large. Carlson criticizes Berlant's aesthetic of engagement for focusing primarily on sensory and formal qualities, thereby making aesthetic appreciation of nature trivial and subjective and potentially isolating the appreciation of art from that of a larger world. Since contemporary art appreciation clearly involves conceptual knowledge and understanding that goes beyond the merely sensuous and formal qualities of the object. The phenomenological approach to aesthetic experience sketched above avoids these criticisms while incorporating the best features of both Berlant's and Carlson's positions. Since all aesthetic experience is founded on a sensuous core, Berlant's description of our continuous perceptual engagement with an aesthetically charged surrounding world are appropriate. But Berlant overlooks the phenomenologically valid distinctions between objects of human design and those relatively free of human interventions. This distinction suggests that aesthetic appreciation of these different objects and of the cases that range between them may be informed by conceptual knowledge, and even that such conceptual knowledge may direct our perceptual scale and framing of these objects. Contra Carlson, the phenomenological view does not prioritize conceptual knowledge over the many other aspects of our complete aesthetic experience, including emotional, imaginative, ambient and metaphysical aspects, and does not exclude other sources of conceptual knowledge apart from the scientific, such as traditional knowledge or literature. While for Carlson, I quote, "Science is the paradigm of that which reveals objects for what they are with the properties that they have," unquote. Phenomenology sees natural science as an abstraction from life-worldly experience oriented toward certain theoretical and practical pursuits. The most fundamental disclosure of objects as what they are is as they are experienced pre-theoretically within the life world, although this experience may be informed by the conceptualizations and sedimentations of the natural sciences. The contributions of the cognitive approach to ecological aesthetics are therefore not at odds with phenomenological insights. Starting from a basic description of aesthetic experiences that would be applicable both to art and nature, the two accounts may be fruitfully combined for a richer understanding of our holistic aesthetic engagement with the world. Thank you.